Okay, so here's a thought that should genuinely keep you up at night. Everything you've ever learned about human history, the pharaohs, the Romans, the Greeks, the whole sweep of it, fits inside the last 5,000 years. But your species? Your exact body, your exact brain, the same hardware you're using right now to process this sentence? That's been around for over 300,000 years, which means basically 98% of the human story is just gone, missing, unwritten, lived out by people as smart as you, and forgotten so completely we don't even have their names. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yeah, but those were cavemen, right? Grunting, dragging clubs, barely human. You'd call them primitive. Well, you're not alone in thinking that, but unfortunately, you are wrong. And over the next little while, I'm going to show you exactly how wrong, because these people did things that should have been flat out impossible. If this kind of stuff scratches an itch in your brain, go ahead and subscribe. We post this kind of deep dive every single week, and you can hit the bell too if you're feeling spicy. Cool. Now, let me actually blow your mind. Let me set the scene for you first, because the scale of this thing is hard to hold in your head. Picture a clock. A normal 24-hour clock, and let's say that clock represents the entire existence of anatomically modern humans. Homo sapiens, you and me, 300,000 years, all squeezed into one single day from midnight to midnight. Now here's the part that breaks your brain. Everything you've ever read about in a history book, writing, cities, kings, wars you can name, the pyramids, Jesus, Rome, Napoleon, the moon landing, your phone. All of it happens in the final 24 minutes before midnight. 24 minutes out of a 24-hour day. The other 23 hours and 36 minutes? That's the missing part. That's the dark, silent stretch of human existence we know almost nothing about, even though it was packed wall to wall with people exactly like you. Ines, And these weren't dumb people, biding their time, waiting for civilization to start. That's the lie we tell ourselves. We imagine human history as this smooth upward ramp, like everybody was just shuffling along, getting slightly less stupid every century until, boom, agriculture, and then the real show began. But that's not what happened at all. The truth is, the show had been running for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone bothered to write the program. Let me explain, because the first place this whole story falls apart is the question that sounds simple but absolutely is not. When did we even become us? For the longest time, the textbook answer was around 200,000 years ago, give or take. That was the line. Modern humans, about 200,000 years old, popped up in East Africa, end of story. And then in 2017, a site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud absolutely detonated that number. Researchers had actually been poking around this place for decades. It was first explored back in the 1960s when miners stumbled onto some bones, but the modern dating techniques changed everything. They found fossils there. Skulls, jaws, teeth, stone tools, and when they dated them properly, the number came back at 315,000 years old. 315,000! Sit with that for a second. That's not a small tweak. That pushed the origin of our entire species back by more than 100,000 years in one go, and it moved the location to it, not East Africa, where everyone had been looking, but the far northwest corner of the continent. The face on these fossils, basically modern. If you reconstructed it and that person walked past you on the street wearing a hoodie, you would not look twice. The face was ours. The back of the skull was a little more elongated, a little more archaic in shape. The brain case was still evolving its modern rounded form, but the face that the world saw was a human face. Your face. And here's the crazy part about Jebel Irhoud. These people, 300 to 15,000 years ago, were already making sophisticated stone tools. We're talking carefully worked flint, points, blades, the kind of stuff that takes real skill and real planning to produce. And the rock they were napping into tools, some of it was sourced from over 20 miles away. 20 plus miles. That means they were moving across the landscape, carrying materials, planning ahead, understanding that the good stone over there could become the tool you need over here. That's not instinct, that's a mind, that's a person making decisions the same way you decide to grab the good knife from the drawer instead of the dull one. So right away, the picture cracks open. The very dawn of our species, the oldest known Homo sapiens, was a creature with our face, our hands, our planning brain, working stone with patience and skill 315,000 years ago. And then, we have almost nothing. A scatter of bones across a continent and 100 millennia of near total silence. That's the missing time. And it only gets weirder from here. Because here's the thing nobody tells you in school. For most of that missing time, you were not alone. Now, when you imagine the deep past, you probably imagine just humans. Our kind, spreading out, being the only game in town. But that's a brand new situation, historically speaking. Being the only human species on Earth is the weird, lonely exception, not the rule. For the overwhelming majority of the time our species has existed, the planet had multiple kinds of humans living at the same time. At least 5 different human species shared this world simultaneously. Picture that. Picture a world where you might walk over a ridge and meet a person who is human, clearly a thinking, feeling, tool-making person, but a different kind of human than you. Anna. There were the Neanderthals, of course, the famous ones, holding down Europe and Western Asia. There were the Denisovans, this ghostly group we'll come back to in a minute because their story is wild. There was Homo floresiensis over in Indonesia, the so-called hobbits, tiny people barely over 3 feet tall living on the island of Flores. There was Homo naledi down in South Africa. There were others, lingering populations of older types in different corners of the map. Multiple human species, all alive, all at once, all sharing a planet. This wasn't science fiction. This was just Tuesday for about 250,000 years. And they didn't just live side by side, politely ignoring each other. Okay, so here's where it gets personal. They met. They mixed. They had children together, and we know this for an absolute fact because the proof is inside your own body right now. If you have any ancestry from outside Africa, you are carrying around roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA. 2% of your genetic code came from a completely different species of human that went extinct around 40,000 years ago. That's not a metaphor. That's not poetic. That is literal Neanderthal genetic material, copied and recopied down through thousands of generations, sitting in your cells as you watch this. Think about what that actually means. At some point, deep in the missing time, one of your ancestors, a Homo sapiens, met a Neanderthal, and they didn't run, and they didn't fight. They paired up. They had a baby. And that baby survived and grew up and had its own babies and on down an unbroken chain that leads directly to you. You are the living result of a love story between 2 different human species. A story so old that the other species in it no longer exists anywhere on Earth except as a whisper in your blood. That 2% does real work too. Neanderthal genes affect things like your immune response, how your skin and hair behave, even how your body handles certain environments. They lent us tools for surviving the cold north that they'd already spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting. And it gets even stranger because the Neanderthals aren't the only ghost in your genome. Speaking of mysterious extinct cousins, Let me tell you about the Denisovans because their whole existence is one of the most insane stories in all of science. We didn't even know they existed until 2010. And how did we discover an entire species of human? Not from a skeleton, not from a skull, from a single finger bone. One pinky bone fragment found in a cave in Siberia called Denisova Cave. Some scientists pulled DNA out of this one tiny scrap of bone, sequenced it, and the results made no sense. It wasn't a modern human, it wasn't a Neanderthal. It was something new. An entire branch of the human family tree that nobody had ever known about, revealed by a single finger, Sekenin. And then, exactly like the Neanderthals, it turned out the Denisovans are also still walking around inside living people. If your ancestry traces to places like Papua, New Guinea, Melanesia, parts of Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, you can be carrying up to around 5% Denisovan DNA. 5%. Even more than the Neanderthal contribution. And that DNA is not just along for the ride. There's a famous example where a gene inherited from Denisovans helps people in Tibet survive at extreme high altitude, processing oxygen in thin mountain air in a way that would leave the rest of us gasping. A species we discovered from a pinky bone is right now keeping people alive on the roof of the world. That's the kind of thing that's been quietly happening in the missing time, and we're only just now finding the fingerprints. No. So let's recalibrate. The deep past was not a lonely place with one struggling band of proto-humans. It was a crowded, complicated world of multiple human species, meeting, trading, fighting, falling in love, having children, swapping genes, sharing the same valleys and rivers and night skies. And the one species we tend to write off the hardest, the Neanderthals, the ultimate cliché for dumb caveman, turns out to be the one that shatters every assumption you've got. Because here's the thing I really need you to understand about Neanderthals. They were not the knuckle-dragging brutes from the cartoons. Not even close. Their brains were, on average, actually as large as ours. In fact, slightly larger by raw volume. They made complex tools. They controlled fire and used it deliberately for cooking, for warmth, for protection. They made clothing to survive brutal Ice Age winters that would kill an unprepared modern person in hours. They hunted enormous, terrifying animals, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, up close with thrusting spears, which is about the most dangerous way to get food that has ever been invented. The bones of Neanderthal men often show injuries similar to what you see in modern rodeo riders because grappling a mammoth at spear's length is genuinely comparable to being thrown around by a furious bull. And they cared for each other. This is the part that gets me. We found Neanderthal skeletons of individuals who lived for many years with devastating injuries and disabilities. A man missing an arm, blind in one eye, with a withered leg, who somehow survived into old age in an Ice Age world. You do not survive like that on your own. Somebody fed him, somebody protected him, somebody decided that this person, who could no longer hunt or contribute the way the others did, was still worth keeping alive. That is compassion. That is community. That is, frankly, more humanity than some people manage today. But here's the one that really gets me, the fact that I think about constantly. Around 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals buried their dead, and not just dumped them in a hole. There's evidence at some sites that they buried them deliberately, carefully, and possibly with flowers. At a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists found a Neanderthal grave surrounded by concentrated clumps of ancient pollen from flowering plants, leading to the idea, debated, sure, argued over, but genuinely there in the evidence, that these people laid their dead to rest on a bed of flowers, yarrow, cornflower, hollyhock, plants that, interestingly, also have medicinal uses. Let me put you in that moment, because I think we skip past it too fast. Picture this. It's 100,000 years ago. The world has no writing, no cities, no farms, no metal, nothing you'd recognize as civilization. And in a cave, a group of Neanderthals, a different species of human, the ones we call stupid, have lost someone they loved. And instead of leaving the body, they dig. They place their dead one gently in the ground, and somebody walks out across the landscape, picks flowers, and brings them back to lay over the grave. 100,000 years before the first word was ever written, somebody who wasn't even technically the same species as you understood grief, understood that a life mattered, understood that you don't just throw away the people you love, you honor them. You to mark the moment. You say goodbye with beauty when that is not an animal. That is a person. And here's the thing that just goes to show how much we've gotten wrong. We have spent generations using the word Neanderthal as an insult, a synonym for stupid and brutish, when the actual Neanderthals were burying their dead with flowers while standing eye to eye with woolly mammoths. The joke, it turns out, was always on us. Now, all of this, the multiple species, the burials, the tool-making, all of it was happening during the missing time, in that vast stretch before anybody wrote anything down. And I want you to really internalize that these people, our people, and our cousins, were not just sitting in caves waiting for history to start. They were doing things, bold things, insane, impossible-seeming things. And nothing makes that clearer than what some of them pulled off around 65,000 years ago when a group of humans looked out at the ocean and decided to cross it. Here's the setup. Around 65,000 years ago, some estimates push it even further back, human beings arrived in Australia. We know they were there because of the archaeological evidence, the tools, the campsites, the deep deposits at sites in the north. People were living in Australia 65,000 years ago. And that, on its own, sounds like a fun fact until you actually look at a map and understand what it took to get there. Because Australia has never, in the entire span of human existence, been connected to mainland Asia by land. Not even during the ice ages when sea levels dropped hundreds of feet. There was always open water in the way. Always. And then even at the lowest sea levels, when so much water was locked up in ice that you could walk across land bridges that don't exist today, getting to Australia still required crossing the sea. The shortest possible route, with the most generous assumptions, still meant crossing at least 90 kilometers of open ocean. 90 kilometers, that's well over 50 miles, of water with no land in sight for big chunks of the journey, depending on the exact route and conditions. And these are people 65,000 years ago. No metal, no maps, no compass, no sail that we know of for certain. And they crossed it. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you cold. This was not an accident. This is the thing people get wrong. They imagine some poor souls clinging to a log, swept out to sea by a storm, washing up on a beach by dumb luck. But the numbers don't work for that. For a population to actually take hold in Australia, to survive and grow and spread across an entire continent, you need a viable founding group. You need men and women, enough of them, arriving with enough resources and knowledge to start a society. You don't get that from one unlucky guy on a log. You get that from a planned voyage, multiple boats, or repeated crossings, carrying enough people to make a go of it. Somebody looked at the horizon, at water stretching past the edge of the visible world, and said, "There's land out there. I know it. Let's build something that floats and go find it." And think about the sheer nerve of that. You're standing on a beach 65,000 years ago. The whole concept of the world to you is what you can see and what your people remember. And in front of you is the ocean, going on forever with monstrous things in it, no guarantee of anything on the other side, and you decide to build a watercraft. Out of bamboo, out of wood, out of whatever you've got, load it with your family and your tools and your hopes, and paddle off the edge of everything you know toward a smudge on the horizon you're not even sure is real. That is one of the boldest, most jaw-dropping acts of courage and intelligence in the entire human story. And it happened tens of thousands of years before anybody built a city. People with our brains doing the impossible in the missing time. And they didn't just survive the crossing. They thrived. They spread across an entire continent and developed the longest continuous living cultures on Earth, traditions that in some unbroken sense reach from that first crossing all the way to today. All of it kicked off by a sea voyage that the experts long assumed was simply beyond the ability of primitive people. Which just goes to show, again and again, that we keep underestimating these minds because they didn't leave us a written note explaining how clever they were. 9. Now, let me knock down another big one, because this is a belief almost everybody carries around without ever questioning it. You probably assume that life back then, before farming, before civilization, was absolutely miserable, nasty, brutish, and short, right? Constant starvation, constant struggle, a desperate scramble for survival every single waking second, and then you die at 25 from a hangnail. That's the picture, and it makes us feel great about ourselves, because look how far we've come. But here's the twist that's going to mess with you. By a lot of measures, those hunter-gatherers were doing better than the farmers who came after them, in some ways better than us. Let me explain. Studies of hunter-gatherer societies, both ancient evidence and observations of groups who live this way into modern times, suggest that the work needed to actually feed yourself was shockingly light. We're talking something like 3 to 5 hours a day spent on getting food. 3 to 5 hours, that's it. The rest of the day? Socializing, storytelling, making art, resting, playing with kids, crafting tools just because, hanging out. Compare that to the 8, 10, 12-hour grind that became normal once agriculture locked humanity into the fields. And honestly, compare it to your own work week. The hunter-gatherer, the supposed primitive scraping by on the edge of death, had more leisure time than you probably do. Why? Because a varied diet of wild foods is genuinely abundant when you know the land. They ate dozens, sometimes hundreds of different plants and animals across the seasons. Nuts, fruits, roots, tubers, fish, game, eggs, honey, greens. A diet that diverse means that if one food source has a bad year, you've got a dozen others to fall back on. It's resilient, it's flexible, and it's nutritionally incredible compared to what came next. Because here's the brutal irony of the agricultural revolution. When humans switched to farming, they didn't switch to a varied banquet. They switched to depending heavily on a tiny number of staple crops. Wheat, rice, corn, calorie-dense, sure. Easy to store, sure, but nutritionally narrow. You can grow a lot of wheat in one field, which means you can feed a lot more people, which is why farming won out. It supports bigger populations. But the individual quality of life? It crashed. And we can see this crash written directly into the bones. This is the part that I find genuinely staggering. When you compare the skeletons of late hunter-gatherers to the skeletons of the early farmers who replaced them, the farmers are worse off in almost every measurable way. The early farmers were shorter. As the agricultural diet took hold, average human height actually dropped by several inches in some populations because people weren't getting the rich, varied nutrition their hunter-gatherer ancestors had. Let that land. The so-called advance of civilization literally made people smaller, and it's not just height. The early farmers' bones and teeth show more signs of nutritional deficiency, more anemia, more vitamin shortfalls from leaning on one or two crops. Their teeth were a disaster compared to the hunter-gatherers. Way more cavities and tooth decay because suddenly the diet was loaded with starchy grains that rot your teeth instead of the tough, varied wild foods that kept hunter-gatherer mouths relatively healthy. They show more signs of physical stress, more evidence of overwork from the grinding, repetitive labor of farming. And on top of all that, packing people together in permanent settlements next to their animals and their own waste created the perfect breeding ground for disease. Epidemics, plagues, the whole catalog of crowd diseases. Most of that is a gift from agriculture. The hunter-gatherers, moving in small mobile bands, mostly dodged all of it. So think about how upside down this is from what you were taught. We're told farming was this glorious leap forward, the moment humanity got serious and civilization could finally bloom. And in terms of sheer numbers and the ability to build cities and armies and pyramids, sure, it was a turning point, but for the actual human being living through it, for the individual person, the early agricultural revolution was, in a lot of ways, a downgrade. Shorter, sicker, more overworked, more diseased, eating a more boring and less nutritious diet with less free time. One researcher famously called the adoption of agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race, and when you look at those bones, it's genuinely hard to argue. The hunter-gatherers in the missing time weren't poor, primitive wretches waiting to be saved by the plow. They were tall, healthy, well-fed people working part-time hours and spending the rest of their lives on each other and on art and stories. Which brings me to the art, because if you still have any lingering doubt that these were fully modern minds capable of beauty, abstraction, imagination on the level of any artist alive today, the art is going to end that doubt forever. Ninan. Let me take you into a cave. Picture this. You're in the south of France. There's a cliff face, and behind it, sealed off from the world for tens of thousands of years by a collapse that blocked the entrance, there's a cavern. This is Chauvet Cave, and in 1994, when explorers squeezed through and shone their lights on the walls, they found themselves staring at one of the greatest art galleries ever made by human hands. Hundreds of paintings, horses, lions, rhinos, bears, mammoths, bison, rendered with a skill and an artistry that is honestly breathtaking. These aren't crude stick figures. These are dynamic, shaded, three-dimensional, full of motion and life. There's a panel of lions that looks like it's caught in mid-hunt, the animals layered to create depth and movement, the kind of sophisticated technique you'd expect from a trained master. And here's the number that should knock you flat. The Chauvet paintings are around 36,000 years old. Some of the oldest are even older, 36,000 years. Let me give you a comparison so it actually means something, because big numbers go numb in your head. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the ancient wonder, the thing that screams deep antiquity to most people, the oldest of the 7 wonders, is roughly 4,500 years old. The Chauvet cave paintings are about 8 times older than the pyramids. 8 times. The distance in time between you and the pyramids is a fraction of the distance between the pyramids and Chauvet. When the pharaohs were building those tombs, the artists of Chauvet had already been dead and forgotten for over 30,000 years. And these weren't beginners fumbling toward art. The technique on display is masterful. The Chauvet painters used the natural bumps and curves of the cave wall to give their animals volume, so a bulge in the rock becomes the shoulder of a bison. They used shading and perspective, where actual perspective, the suggestion of one thing in front of another, of depth, of a real space, Tens of thousands of years before perspective supposedly got invented in Renaissance Italy, they scraped the walls to prepare a clean surface. They used charcoal and ochre. Some scholars think certain sequences of overlapping figures were even meant to suggest motion in flickering torchlight, like the earliest flip book, an animation drawn by firelight on stone in the deep dark. And this is the thing, Chauvet isn't a fluke. There's cave art all over the place from the deep past. Lascaux, Altamira, sites across Europe, across Indonesia, across the world, some of them now dated even older than Chauvet. There are hand stencils, somebody putting their palm on the wall and blowing pigment around it, leaving a print that says, "I was here, I existed," that are 40,000 years old and more. Imagine that. A human being, deep in the Ice Age, pressing their hand to cold stone and spraying paint to leave a mark across 40,000 years, straight to you. You can put your hand up next to theirs, same size, same shape, same hand den. Now, here's a story that perfectly captures how badly we've underestimated these people. And it's almost funny. When the cave paintings at Altamira in Spain were first discovered, back in the late 1800s, and brought to the attention of the experts of the day, the experts refused to believe they were ancient. They flat out rejected them. They accused the man who found them of faking the whole thing, of hiring an artist to paint them as a hoax. And why? Why couldn't the leading scientific minds of the 19th century accept that these paintings were real and old? Because the art was too good. That was the actual objection. The paintings were too skillful, too beautiful, too sophisticated to have possibly been made by ancient, primitive cave people. It must be a fraud, they said, because cavemen simply couldn't have done this. It took years, decades, really, and the discovery of more and more cave art elsewhere before the experts were finally forced to admit they were wrong, that yes, Ice Age humans really did paint these masterpieces, and the man they'd called a fraud had been telling the truth all along, though he died before he was ever vindicated. And I love this story because it's the whole problem in miniature. Our gut assumption that ancient people were stupid is so powerful that even trained scientists, looking directly at the evidence, chose to believe in a conspiracy rather than accept that a caveman could be a genius. The art was too good to be that old. That sentence should be carved somewhere as a warning, because it's exactly the bias that's caused us to ignore 98% of our own story. Nainan. The people who painted Chauvet and Altamira had the full package. Imagination, abstraction, symbolic thought. The ability to plan a complex project, to mix pigments, to work by firelight deep underground, to represent the living world with skill and feeling, and even a sense of the spiritual, because a lot of this art was made in the deepest, hardest-to-reach parts of caves, far from where anyone lived, which suggests it wasn't decoration. It was something sacred, something ritual, something meant. These were people with rich inner lives, with religion or something like it, with stories they were telling on the walls in the dark. Same brain as you, same need to make meaning. They just lived in the missing time, so we forgot. They were geniuses. Here's where it all comes together into the single most haunting idea in this whole story. Because you might be wondering, okay, if there were all these people for hundreds of thousands of years doing all these incredible things, where's all of it? Why is so much of it gone? Why do we have to piece together the human epic from a finger bone here and a flower grave there and a handful of caves that happen to get sealed up? Where did the missing time physically go? 9. And a huge part of the answer is genuinely chilling. It's underwater. Here's the thing nobody thinks about. During the last ice age, an absolutely staggering amount of the planet's water was locked up in colossal ice sheets. miles thick, sprawling across the northern continents. All that frozen water came from somewhere. It came from the oceans, and so during the Ice Age, global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. How much lower? Around 400 feet lower. 400 feet. Let that sink in. The shoreline of the Ice Age world wasn't where it is now. It was way, way out, sometimes tens or even hundreds of miles out from today's coast. And now think about where people like to live. Where do humans settle, today and always? The coast, the shoreline, river mouths, estuaries, beaches, the rich edge where the land meets the sea. It's the best real estate there is. Abundant food, fish and shellfish, fresh water, trade routes, mild climate. Coastlines are where human populations concentrate. They always have been. So for all those tens of thousands of years of low sea levels, the prime human territory, the places where the most people probably lived, where they fished and built and gathered and maybe made their boldest cultural leaps, was along coastlines that today are drowned, submerged, hundreds of feet underwater, miles offshore, buried under the sea. And then the Ice Age ended. The ice melted, and the oceans rose, not gently over 100,000 years, but in some periods relatively fast, rising and swallowing the old coastlines whole. An entire world of human settlement, potentially the richest and most populated part of the prehistoric world, was flooded and lost. Drowned cities of the Stone Age, maybe, well, not cities, but villages, camps, sacred sites, who knows what. All of it now sitting silent under 400 feet of dark water scattered across continental shelves all around the globe. This is what archaeologists sometimes call the drowned world, and it might be the single biggest reason the missing time is so missing. We're not finding the heart of prehistoric human life because we're looking in the wrong place. We're looking on dry land. On what was, back then, the high, marginal, less desirable interior. The good stuff, the coastal stuff, is out at sea, under sediment, crushed by tides and time, almost completely unrecoverable with the tools we've got. Every now and then, a fishing trawler drags up a mammoth tooth or a stone tool from the bottom of the North Sea, a place that was once dry land where people hunted and lived. A sunken country sometimes nicknamed Doggerland, and it's this tiny, tantalizing hint of the vast lost world down there in the dark. So, when you ask where the missing 100,000 years went, a big chunk of the honest answer is, it sank. It's underwater. The story of the Ice Age coastal peoples, the fishers, the seafarers, the ones who maybe figured out boats and ocean travel and who knows what before anyone else, is mostly beyond our reach, drowned by the very thaw that ended their world. And that means our entire picture of the deep human past is built from the leftovers. The scraps that happened to survive on high ground, in deep caves, in dry deserts, in the few places where time was kind. We are reconstructing the most important book ever written from the handful of pages that didn't get torn out and thrown in the ocean. Which, when you really think about it, makes everything we have found even more astonishing. Because everything I've told you, Jebel Irhoud, and the 315,000-year-old face, the 5 human species sharing a planet, the Neanderthal, and Denisovan DNA woven into your own body, the flower burials at Shanidar, the deliberate sea crossing to Australia, the tall, healthy hunter-gatherers working part-time, the 36,000-year-old masterpieces at Chauvet, the experts who couldn't believe the art was real. All of that is just what survived. That's the visible tip. That's the 24 minutes before midnight. The other 23.5 hours, the real bulk of who we were and what we did, is largely lost, drowned, dissolved, scattered to the wind. And I think that should change how you see yourself, because you are not the smart end of a long line of idiots. You are the latest link in a chain of geniuses, people with your exact brain who painted in the dark, who crossed oceans on faith, who buried their loved ones with flowers, who fed and protected the weak, who looked at a slab of stone and saw a horse in it. They didn't have writing, so they left us almost nothing, and we paid them back by calling them stupid. But they were us, fully, completely, undeniably us. The missing 100,000 years isn't a gap in some other species' history. It's the missing chapters of your own family story, and the more you look at the few pages we've got, the more obvious it becomes that we have been wildly, almost insultingly underestimating the people we came from this entire time. Turns out the cavemen were the smartest people we ever forgot. So let's go back into that drowned world for a second, because I glossed over something and it deserves its own moment. I mentioned Doggerland, the sunken country under the North Sea. Almost like a footnote, but Doggerland is one of the most haunting places that ever existed, and the fact that you've probably never heard of it is the whole problem in a nutshell. Picture this. You're standing in what is now the middle of the cold gray North Sea between Britain and the Netherlands. Except there is no sea. There's land under your feet. Rolling hills, marshes, winding rivers, lakes full of fish, forests full of deer and wild boar and aurochs, those massive ancient wild cattle. There are people here, thousands of them, maybe more. This is some of the best land in all of Ice Age Europe, a lush lowland paradise teeming with life, and it's home to a thriving population of hunter-gatherers who have absolutely no idea that their entire homeland is going to vanish. Because it did. As the ice melted and the seas rose, Doggerland shrank, decade by decade, century by century. The rivers backed up. The marshes turned to salt. The coastline crept inland, eating villages, eating hunting grounds, eating memory. For a while, it became a great island, and then a smaller island, and then it was gone. There's even evidence that a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, a thing called the Storegga Slide, sent a colossal tsunami crashing across what was left of Doggerland around 8,000 years ago, possibly drowning the final survivors in a single afternoon. An entire nation of people, an entire country with its own geography and its own way of life, swallowed whole by the sea and erased so thoroughly that until fishermen started dragging up bones and tools and the famous barbed harpoon points, we didn't even know it was there. And that's just one drowned land in one cold sea. Multiply that around the whole planet. Multiply it across every continental shelf, every flooded river valley, every coastline that used to be miles farther out. Doggerland is not the exception. It's a single visible example of the rule. The missing time is full of Doggerlands, whole worlds of human life, gone under the water, taking their stories with them. And the people of Doggerland weren't primitives clinging to survival either. They were skilled, settled, deeply at home in a rich landscape. The inheritors of all those tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. They just had the bad luck to live somewhere that the ocean decided to reclaim. Now, here's a question that probably popped into your head a while back, and I want to deal with it head on, because it's a good one. If these ancient people were so smart, so capable, so fully modern in the brain, why did it take so long? Why 300,000 years before anybody built a city or wrote a word? If the hardware was there from the start, what was the holdup? And this is genuinely one of the most fascinating puzzles in the whole story, so let me explain, because the answer is not what you'd guess. The answer is basically it wasn't a holdup at all. We've been asking the wrong question. We assume that cities and writing and agriculture are the natural goal, the obvious endpoint that everybody should have been sprinting toward, and that anything before that was just a delay, a long, awkward waiting room before civilization could finally open its doors. But flip it around. What if cities and farming weren't the obvious good thing? What if, for hundreds of thousands of years, the hunter-gatherer way of life was simply working and working well? We already talked about this. They were tall, they were healthy, they worked a few hours a day, they had deep social bonds and art and time. Why on earth would people living that life look at the brutal, back-breaking, disease-ridden grind of early farming and think, yes, sign me up, let's all crowd into a mud village and break our backs in a wheat field and get sick and short? Next, they wouldn't, and mostly they didn't. Not for the longest time, not until they basically had to. Here's the thing that turns out to be true. Agriculture wasn't a brilliant invention that humans were too dumb to think of for 300,000 years and then finally cracked. The knowledge of how plants grow was obvious to any hunter-gatherer. They knew exactly where seeds came from, when fruits ripened, how to encourage useful plants. They could have farmed long before they did. They chose not to because their lives were better without it. The shift to farming, when it finally came, seems to have been driven by pressure, climate change at the end of the Ice Age, growing populations in certain rich spots, the need to settle down and tend resources in specific places. It was less a triumphant leap and more a trap that slowly closed. Once you commit to farming, once your population grows on the back of all those stored grain calories, you can't go back. You've got too many mouths. You're locked in. You have to keep farming, keep working, keep grinding forever. So the 300,000 wasted years weren't wasted at all. They were a stable, successful, sustainable way of being human that lasted vastly longer than civilization has so far, and which only ended because the conditions changed and squeezed people into a new and harder mode of living. We didn't fail to invent civilization for 300,000 years. We succeeded at a different kind of life for 300,000 years, and civilization is the recent, weird, intense, demanding thing that came after. Which, again, just goes to show how upside down our whole framing has been. We measure those ancestors by how close they were getting to us, when maybe we should be measuring ourselves by how far we've drifted from a way of living that genuinely worked. And here's the crazy part. When humans did finally start building monumental stuff, they did it in an order that breaks the rules we thought we understood. You've heard, probably, the standard story of how civilization is supposed to happen. First, you invent farming. Farming gives you surplus food. Surplus food lets some people stop farming and become priests and builders and rulers. Then you get towns, then cities, then big monuments and temples. Farming first, then the temples. That's the sequence everybody learned. It makes sense. It's logical. And then they dug up a hill in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, and the whole logical sequence fell apart. Let me set this up. There's a site in southeastern Turkey on a hilltop, and starting in the 1990s, archaeologists began uncovering something they were not prepared for. Massive stone pillars, some of them 16 feet tall, some weighing in the range of 10, even 20 tons, arranged in great circles. And these pillars aren't plain. They're carved beautifully with animals. Foxes, snakes, scorpions, boars, vultures, cranes, lions, rendered in relief with real artistry. Some of the pillars are shaped like stylized human figures, with arms and hands and belts carved into the stone. It's a monumental complex, a temple, a gathering place, something clearly built for ritual and meaning, requiring the coordinated labor of a lot of people to quarry, carve, transport, and raise these enormous stones. And here's the number. Göbekli Tepe is around 11,000 to 12,000 years old. That makes it thousands of years older than Stonehenge. Thousands of years older than the pyramids. It is, by a wide margin, the oldest known monumental religious architecture on the planet. When this thing was built, the pyramids were still around 7,000 years in the future. But that's not even the part that broke everyone's brain. The part that broke everyone's brain is this. It was built by hunter-gatherers before agriculture. The people who quarried those 20-ton pillars and carved those vultures and raised those great stone circles on that hill did not, as far as we can tell, farm. They were still hunting wild game and gathering wild plants. There's no evidence of domesticated crops at the start. This colossal sacred monument was raised by foragers. Do you see why that's such a bombshell? The whole accepted story said you need farming first to free up the labor and organization for monuments. Göbekli Tepe says no. It says hunter-gatherers, the supposed primitives, the ones who hadn't even invented farming yet, were capable of organizing hundreds of people, of feeding that workforce somehow, of conceiving and executing a massive architectural and artistic project driven purely by shared belief. And here's the twist. That's almost too good. Some researchers now think the sequence might actually be backwards from what we assumed. The theory goes that the need to feed all the people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe, the crowds drawn to this sacred site, may have been one of the pressures that pushed people toward farming in the first place. In other words, maybe the temple came first and farming was invented partly to support the temple. The monument didn't come from civilization. Civilization might have come from the monument. Belief first, bread second, nomansel. And then, as if Göbekli Tepe wasn't strange enough, here's the final mystery. After being used for centuries, the whole complex was deliberately buried. The people who built it didn't abandon it and let it crumble. They intentionally filled it in with rubble and earth, packing the great stone circles in dirt, burying their own temple on purpose. Why? We don't really know. Maybe it was a ritual closing, a kind of sacred decommissioning. Maybe the meaning of the place changed, but that act of careful burial is actually why it survived so well for us to find. The people of the missing time 11,000 years ago accidentally time-capsuled one of the greatest mysteries of human history by tucking their cathedral into the earth, and we only scratched the surface. Large parts of the site are still unexcavated, still down there, waiting. There could be more, even older, even stranger. Hey now, I want to pull on this thread of how smart these people actually were, because it goes way deeper than building an art. It gets right down into the way their minds worked, the way they understood the world around them. And there's a category of knowledge here that I find absolutely staggering, which is what they knew about the sky and about plants and about medicine, tens of thousands of years before science as we know it existed. Nana, let me start with the sky. Imagine your nights. Really imagine them. You live in a world with zero artificial light. No street lamps, no phone screens, no glow on the horizon from a distant city. When the sun goes down, it gets dark, truly, completely dark. And overhead, the entire universe comes out. The full, blazing band of the Milky Way arcs across the sky. Thousands upon thousands of stars, planets wandering along their paths, the moon marching through its phases, meteors streaking down, and you see this every single clear night of your entire life. Of course, these people knew the sky intimately. The stars were their calendar, their clock, their map, their mythology, their television. They knew which stars rose with which seasons, which signaled the coming of the rains, or the migration of the herds, or the time to move camp. They tracked the moon's cycle, the sun's slow swing between its summer and winter extremes. And there's tantalizing evidence that some of this astronomical knowledge goes back astonishingly far. There are markings, sequences of dots and lines, scratched onto bones in cave walls deep in the Ice Age. Some scholars argue that certain of these are lunar calendars, careful tallies of the days of the moon's cycle, made by people 30,000, even 40,000 years ago, counting the days, tracking the moon, keeping time by firelight on a piece of bone. Whether every single example holds up to scrutiny is argued over, sure, but the broad point stands. These were people watching the heavens with patience and precision, building knowledge across generations, passing it down through story and song because they had no other way to store it. Their minds were libraries, and when a person died, a whole library could burn down with them unless they taught it forward. That's part of why so much is lost. It was never written, only remembered, and memory dies with the rememberer. And here's the crazy part about that oral knowledge. We used to assume that anything passed down by word of mouth would get garbled and lost within a few generations, like a game of telephone. Stories drift, details warp, and after a couple hundred years, it's all myth and nonsense, right? Well, turns out in some cases, oral tradition can preserve real information for an almost impossible length of time. There are Aboriginal Australian stories, passed down purely by mouth, generation to generation, that appear to accurately describe the rising of the sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. Stories that describe specific stretches of coastline that are now underwater, that talk about where the shore used to be, about islands that were once connected to the mainland, about land that the sea swallowed, and when scientists check those descriptions against the geological record of where the coast actually was thousands of years ago, they match. And let that land for a second. That means some of these stories may have been told mouth to mouth, parent to child, around fires, for something on the order of 7, 8, even 10,000 years, with enough fidelity that they still contain accurate geographic information about a coastline that drowned at the end of the Ice Age. 10,000 years of unbroken storytelling. That is one of the longest-running threads of human memory we know of, a living link reaching all the way back into the missing time, and it survived not on stone or paper, but on the breath of person after person after person, refusing to let the knowledge die. Which just goes to show that no writing never meant no records. It meant the records were people. The records were the elders, the storytellers, the keepers of the songs. We just didn't think to value that as real knowledge because it didn't come on a clay tablet. Now, let me talk about medicine.
Because this one really gets me. We picture ancient people as helpless against illness and injury. You get sick, you suffer, you die, nothing to be done.
But the deep human past is full of evidence that people were actively treating ailments, managing injuries, and using plants as medicine in genuinely sophisticated ways. Remember those flowers at the Neanderthal grave in Shanidar? Yarrow, hollyhock. Plants that, as it happens, have real medicinal properties. There's a strong case that ancient people, including Neanderthals, knew which plants did what. We've actually found evidence in the dental plaque of Neanderthal skulls, the hardened gunk on their teeth, which traps tiny food and plant particles for tens of thousands of years, wary of them consuming plants with no nutritional value, but real medicinal punch. One famous example, a Neanderthal with a nasty dental abscess and a stomach bug appears to have been chewing poplar, which contains the natural compound that aspirin is based on, plus a kind of natural antibiotic mold, a sick Neanderthal self-medicating with the original aspirin and a natural penicillin 50,000 years ago. Tell me again about dumb cavemen. Now, and then there's the surgery. Yes, surgery. There's an ancient practice called trepanation, drilling or scraping a hole into a living person's skull. And we have skulls from the deep past, going back many thousands of years, with neat holes cut into them. Now, here's the staggering part. We can tell from the bone whether the person survived the operation, because if they lived, the edges of the hole show signs of healing. The bone grows back smooth around the wound, and a huge number of these trepanned skulls show healing. The people survived. Some show multiple holes, healed at different times, meaning the same person underwent this brain surgery more than once and lived through it each time. Stone Age people were cutting holes in each other's skulls with stone tools, and the patients were waking up and recovering and walking around afterward, sometimes for years. The survival rate in some samples is genuinely impressive, better than you'd expect from skull surgery in much more recent history. They understood enough about cleanliness, about technique, about the structure of the head to pull off brain surgery in the Stone Age and not kill the patient. That is not luck. That is accumulated medical knowledge, refined over generations in the missing time. So step back and look at the full portrait we're building here. These were people who watched and understood the stars, who kept calendars on bone, who preserved accurate knowledge across 10,000 years of pure memory, who knew which plants healed and which plants killed, who self-medicated with aspirin's ancestor and natural antibiotics, who performed survivable brain surgery with stone tools, who buried their dead with flowers and meaning, who built 20-ton stone temples before they farmed, who crossed oceans on purpose, who painted masterpieces in the dark. Every single time we dig a little deeper, the primitive label looks more and more absurd, and the real picture that emerges is of people who were intellectually, emotionally, creatively, completely our equals. The only thing they lacked was writing and the accumulated technology that writing eventually unlocked. The minds were identical. The minds were ours. Down-ins. And this brings up something that I think is the most mind-bending implication of the whole missing time, and I want to walk you right up to it. We tend to think of human progress as cumulative and permanent. Once humanity figures something out, we assume we've got it forever. Knowledge only ever goes up. Civilization only ever advances. But the deep past tells a different and much scarier story. Knowledge can be lost. Whole bodies of understanding, whole technologies, whole ways of life, they can simply disappear, vanish from the human record, sometimes for thousands of years, sometimes forever. We already know this happens even within recorded history. Let me give you an example that perfectly bridges the gap. There's an object called the Antikythera mechanism. Picture this. It's 1901, and sponge divers off a tiny Greek island called Antikythera are exploring an ancient shipwreck on the seabed, a wreck more than 2,000 years old. Among the statues and the amphorae and the treasure, they bring up a lump of corroded bronze and wood, crusted and unremarkable, easy to overlook. And it sits in a museum for a while before anyone realizes what it actually is. Because when researchers finally study it, and it takes decades and modern imaging technology to fully understand it, they find that this corroded lump is a machine. A device made of dozens of precisely cut bronze gears, interlocking, intricate, a clockwork computer built over 2,000 years ago to model the movements of the heavens. You turn a crank, and it calculates the positions of the sun and the moon, the phases of the moon, the timing of eclipses, the cycles of astronomical events, even the schedule of the ancient games. It is an analog computer of breathtaking sophistication. And here's the part that should chill you. After the Antikythera mechanism, nothing of comparable complexity appears in the human record for something like 1,000 to 1,400 years. The knowledge of how to build geared mechanisms that intricate just evaporated. It was lost. Whoever could make these things died, or their workshops were destroyed, or the chain of teaching broke. And that level of precision engineering didn't show up again until the elaborate astronomical clocks of medieval Europe. Well over a millennium later, humanity invented a clockwork computer and then forgot how, and stayed forgetting for 1,000 years. That happened within recorded history. We have the object. We can hold the proof of the forgetting in our hands. Now extend that logic backward into the missing time. If knowledge that advanced could vanish for 1,000 years within the documented era, How much was discovered, perfected, and lost over and over in cycle after cycle across the 300,000 unrecorded years before? How many times did some group of brilliant people figure out something remarkable, a technique, a craft, a body of astronomical or medical knowledge, only for it to die with them when their tribe was scattered, when their coast was drowned, when a drought or a disaster broke the thread of teaching? We have no idea. We can't have any idea, because the whole defining feature of the missing time is that it left no records to lose in the first place. The losses are invisible. We can't even count the ghosts. Nina, this is the thing that genuinely keeps me up. Human history, the real full sweep of it, isn't a smooth staircase climbing forever upward. It's more like a flickering candle in a vast dark room. Knowledge flares up, illuminates a little circle, and then often gutters out, and the darkness rushes back in, and somewhere else, sometime later, another candle flares. We happen to be living in a stretch where the candle has been burning unusually bright and unusually long because writing finally let us stop forgetting, let us bank our knowledge outside of any single fragile human memory. Writing is the trick that broke the cycle of forgetting. That's the actual revolution. Not farming, not cities. Writing. The ability to store a mind on a surface so that when the mind dies, the knowledge doesn't tangerine. And that reframes everything about the missing time. For 300,000 years, people just as smart as you lived and learned and discovered and created, and then forgot because they had no way to hold on to it across the generations except memory, and memory leaks, and memory dies. They weren't less capable. They were running without a save function. Every brilliant insight had to be carried in living heads and retold and retaught. And any break in that chain, a bad winter, a flood, a death of the wrong elder at the wrong time, could erase discoveries that had taken centuries to build. They were geniuses playing a game with no checkpoints, where one bad moment could send entire bodies of human achievement straight back to zero, which, when you think about it, makes the things that did survive almost miraculous. The cave painting survived because they happened to be sealed in the dark. Göbekli Tepe survived because someone buried it. The Australian sea level stories survived because of an unbroken, almost unbelievable chain of careful storytellers. The Neanderthal DNA survived because it's physically copied into living bodies. The Antikythera mechanism survived because it sank to the bottom of the sea and the water protected it. Every relic of the deep past that we have is a freak accident of preservation, a lottery ticket that happened to win against time. And for every one that won, untold thousands lost, dissolved, drowned, decayed, forgotten. What we have isn't the story. It's the handful of pages that didn't burn. And here's where I want to bring it back around to you, sitting there, because there's a strange and beautiful flip side to all of this gloom about forgetting. You are the inheritor of every single thread that didn't break. Think about that chain of storytellers passing down the memory of a drowned coastline for 10,000 years. Think about the unbroken line of tool-making technique handed down from the people of Jebel Irhoud, parent to child, 315,000 years deep. Think about the genes from a Neanderthal who fell in love in an Ice Age valley, copied faithfully into your own cells right now. You are not separate from the missing time. You are the living end of it. Every thread that survived runs straight through you. You're holding the winning lottery tickets of 300,000 years of human striving, and most people walk around having no idea they're even holding them. Yeah. Now, speaking of those threads that connect us across impossible distances of time, let me take you to one of the most poignant kinds of evidence we have from the deep past, because it's not a grand monument or a clever machine. It's small and it's intimate and it'll stay with you. I'm talking about footprints. Actual footprints pressed into ancient mud that hardened and was buried and preserved and then uncovered tens of thousands of years later. Because a footprint is not a tool or an artwork that took skill. A footprint is just a person in a moment, walking. It's the most ordinary thing imaginable, and that's exactly what makes it devastating. There's a set of footprints found at a place called White Sands in New Mexico, and they've been dated to somewhere in the range of 21,000 to 23,000 years old. And that's a big deal because it suggests people were in the Americas thousands of years earlier than the old textbooks claimed. But set the dating debate aside for a second and just look at what the footprints show. There's a trackway of a young person, maybe a teenager or a young adult, walking quickly across the muddy margin of an ancient lake carrying a small child. You can see it. The prints are deeper and the stride changes where they shifted the child's weight from one hip to the other. At a couple of points, the prints show the child was set down. Small toddler footprints appear next to the adult ones, and then picked back up again, and the journey continued. And on the way back, sometime later, the adult walks the same path alone. No child, just the one set of prints returning. Let that put you right there. 20-some thousand years ago, a young person carried a little kid across a muddy flat near a lake in a hurry. And we know they were in a hurry from the spacing of the steps. That set the child down a few times, maybe to rest their arms, maybe because the kid wanted to walk and then made the return trip without the child, presumably having safely dropped them off somewhere. And there's more. In the same area, the tracks of the giant Ice Age animals cross the path. A giant ground sloth's tracks intersect the human trackway, and you can see where the sloth seems to have reared up and shifted, reacting to the scent or presence of the humans who just passed through. A real moment, a real day, a young person, a child, a dangerous landscape full of giant beasts, an errand, a journey there and back, 20-some thousand years ago, frozen in mud. Speaking directly to you across an abyss of time so vast it barely fits in your head. That's what the missing time really is. It's not an abstract statistic about percentages and timelines. It's a young person with mud between their toes, carrying a tired child, worried about the sloths, hurrying home. It's somebody picking flowers for a grave. It's a hand pressed to a cold cave wall. It's an elder telling a child where the shoreline used to be, knowing the child will tell their child. And on for 10,000 years. It's full of people, real, specific, individual people, each one as vivid and present in their own moment as you are in yours right now. They just had the misfortune of living before anyone invented the trick of writing it down, so to us, they're silent. But they were not silent then. Their world was loud with talk and song and laughter and grief, exactly like yours. And it's happiness. And I think the single most important thing to take from all of this is a kind of humility and also a kind of awe. Humility, because we have spent so long looking down our noses at the deep past, assuming we're the smart ones, the advanced ones, the pinnacle, when really we're just the ones lucky enough to be living in the brief, bright, recorded sliver, standing on a mountain of forgotten genius we didn't build and can barely glimpse. And awe, because despite everything, despite the drownings and the disasters and the forgetting, despite 300,000 years of having no save function, those people still managed to leave us footprints in the mud, paint on the walls, stones raised to the sky, flowers in the graves, stories on the breath, and pieces of themselves stitched into our own DNA. They reached across the dark and touched us anyway, And the more of those touches we find, the more undeniable it becomes that the missing time wasn't empty, and it wasn't primitive, and it wasn't waiting for us. It was already, fully, achingly human. The whole time. Okay, so I want to stay with those footprints for one more beat because they crack open a door into something most people never even think to ask. We talk about the missing time like it's all one place: Africa, Europe, a cave, a hill. But the truth is, during those hundreds of thousands of years, humans went everywhere, and I mean everywhere. The story of how our species spread across the entire planet on foot, with no maps and no idea what was over the next horizon, is itself one of the most insane sagas ever, and it all happened in the silence before history. So let me walk you through it, because the scale of this journey will reset your sense of what these people were capable of. And picture it like this. You start with a population in Africa, the original homeland, the place where our species and all our deep ancestry comes from. And at various points, it wasn't one single exodus, but waves, pulses of people moving out over tens of thousands of years. Groups began to leave. They walked out of Africa, up through the Middle East, and then they just kept going. And here's the thing that I don't think lands for people until you really sit with it. Nobody on these journeys knew where they were going. There was no destination, no let's settle the earth plan. Each generation just pushed a little further into land no human had ever set foot on, following the game, following the rivers, following the coastlines, drawn on by whatever's over there. And over thousands of years of these tiny pushes, humans crossed into Europe, fanned out across the whole of Asia, made that impossible sea crossing to Australia we already talked about, pushed up into the brutal frozen north of Siberia, and eventually crossed into the Americas and ran all the way down to the southern tip of South America. That last stretch deserves its own moment because it's staggering. Humans entered the Americas, whether by the famous land bridge across what's now the Bering Strait, when those low Ice Age sea levels exposed a whole sunken continent called Beringia, connecting Siberia to Alaska, or by boat down the coast, or both. And once they were in, they spread the entire length of 2 continents, from Alaska to the tip of Patagonia. That is something like 10,000 miles of utterly unknown terrain, frozen tundra, towering mountain ranges, scorching deserts, the densest jungle on Earth, every climate and every danger you can imagine. And they covered it on foot in what may have been just a few thousand years, possibly faster. People walked from the top of the world to the bottom of it, crossing every kind of landscape that exists, with stone tools and animal skin clothes and the knowledge in their heads, into lands where no human had ever been to teach them anything. Every plant they met, they had to figure out from scratch. Is this food? Is this poison? Is this medicine? Every animal, every river, every mountain pass. And they did it. Within a startlingly short window, humans had occupied basically every habitable corner of the entire planet. And think about how recent and total that is. By the end of the Ice Age, there were people in the Arctic and people in the Amazon, people in the Australian outback and people in the Siberian wastes, people on remote islands and people in high mountain valleys, all of them descended from that original African population, all of them carrying that same 300,000-year-old brain, all of them adapting to wildly different worlds. And here's the crazy part. This whole planetary conquest, the most ambitious migration in the history of any large animal, happened before writing, before farming, before cities. It's pure missing time achievement, the greatest exploration story ever told. And it has no narrator, no names, no log, just footprints in the mud and stone tools in the dirt, and sometimes the bones of the bold. And they didn't just survive in these extreme places. They mastered them in ways that demanded jaw-dropping ingenuity. Let me take you to the cold, because the cold is where human cleverness really gets tested. Picture this. You are a human being in Ice Age Siberia or Northern Europe. The temperature drops to levels that would kill you, an unprotected modern person, in a matter of hours, maybe less. There's almost no plant food for months at a stretch. The landscape is frozen, the wind is a blade, and the dark lasts most of the day. By every rule of biology, a tropical ape, which is fundamentally what humans are, evolved in the warmth of Africa, has absolutely no business surviving there. And yet people thrived in these conditions for tens of thousands of years. How? Not with bodies built for the cold, with minds, with technology. They invented tailored clothing, not just draping a hide over their shoulders, but actually cutting and fitting and sewing skins into fitted garments, layered with hoods. That trapped body heat. And we know they sewed because we've found eyed needles, delicate needles made of bone and ivory with a tiny hole punched through for thread, going back tens of thousands of years. Stop and think about that. A needle with an eye carved from bone. That is a precision instrument. Somebody, deep in the Ice Age, looked at the problem of staying warm and engineered a sewing needle fine enough to stitch fitted clothing, and then spun cordage or used sinew as thread, and tailored garments good enough to let a tropical animal live through a Siberian winter. That's not survival by luck. That's an engineering solution to a deadly problem invented by people we keep calling primitive. Yeah, nine, and they didn't stop at clothes. In some of these treeless, frozen places where there was no wood to build with, people built houses out of mammoth bones, actual houses, large, round dwellings framed from the massive tusks and skulls and jawbones and leg bones of dozens of mammoths, hundreds of bones per house, hauled and arranged into a sturdy dome and probably covered with hides. We've found whole settlements of these mammoth bone houses across the cold steppe of Eastern Europe and beyond. Imagine the planning in that. You need the bones of dozens of the largest land animals of your world. You need to transport them, some of them enormous and heavy, and you need the architectural know-how to assemble them into a stable structure that'll stand against the wind and hold the heat. These were engineers working with the only building material available, the bones of giants, to make homes in a place that should have been uninhabitable. And the joke we play, calling them simple, is the same joke as always, and it's still on us. And now, speaking of mammoths, let me linger on the animals these people lived alongside, because this is something that I think we totally fail to appreciate, and it transforms how you picture daily life in the deep past. The world of the missing time was not the world you know. It was a world of giants. We call it the megafauna, the giant animals of the Ice Age, and humans shared the landscape with all of them. We've mentioned the woolly mammoth, this huge, shaggy elephant adapted to the cold with curving tusks longer than a person is tall. There was the woolly rhinoceros, another massive, horned, fur-covered beast. There were giant ground sloths, the ones whose tracks crossed those footprints in New Mexico, animals the size of a car or bigger, rearing up taller than a person. There were cave bears, bigger than grizzlies. There were cave lions and saber-toothed cats with those famous dagger fangs. There were aurochs, the gigantic wild ancestors of cattle, and Irish elk, with antlers spanning 12 feet across. In Australia, there were giant kangaroos, marsupial lions, a lizard the size of a crocodile, and a bird taller than a man. In the Americas, there were dire wolves and giant beavers, and herds of horses and camels. Yes, camels and horses. Native to the Americas back then. This was the world humans lived in. Every single day, the people of the missing time walked out into a landscape teeming with enormous, dangerous, magnificent creatures, and they survived among them, and hunted some of them, and feared others, and painted all of them on cave walls with obvious reverence. When the Chauvet artists painted lions and rhinos and mammoths, they weren't painting from imagination or legend, they were painting their neighbors. The animals on those walls were the animals outside the cave. And here's a sobering twist that's tangled up with the human story. Across much of the world, as humans arrived and spread, the megafauna vanished. The giants died out. The mammoths, the giant sloths, the cave bears, the marsupial lions, the giant kangaroos, wave after wave of them went extinct, and the timing, in a lot of places, lines up uncomfortably well with the arrival of humans. The debate rages over how much of it was us, hunting and disrupting, and how much was the dramatic climate shifts at the end of the Ice Age, and the honest answer is probably both, tangled together. But the upshot is haunting. The people of the missing time may have lived through the loss of the giants, may have been the last humans to ever see a living mammoth or a giant sloth, may have watched a whole bestiary of magnificent creatures slip out of the world forever. They witnessed an entire lost world, and they took the memory of it down into the dark with them, leaving us only the paintings and the bones. And that thread, humans changing the world around them, even way back then, is worth pulling because it busts another myth. We like to imagine that ancient people lived in some perfect frozen harmony with nature, gently treading lightly, having zero impact, just one quiet species among many. And in some ways, their footprint was lighter than ours, sure. But the idea that they were passive, that they didn't shape their environment, is wrong. They shaped it constantly, deliberately, and on a massive scale. The biggest tool they used was fire. Across the world, for tens of thousands of years, hunter-gatherers used controlled burning to manage entire landscapes, burning off old growth to encourage fresh, tender plants that drew in game, opening up forests, creating mosaics of grassland and woodland that were more productive for hunting and gathering. They were, in a real sense, gardening whole continents with fire, shaping ecosystems to suit them over countless generations. In Australia, this fire management was so sustained and so sophisticated that it fundamentally altered the vegetation of the continent over tens of thousands of years. These weren't passive wanderers stumbling through a wild garden. They were active managers of their world, with deep, practical, multi-generational ecological knowledge, deliberately engineering the land to be more abundant. Which, again, just goes to show that the gap between them and us was never about intelligence or capability. It was only ever about the tools and the records. Now let me come back to the inside of these people, because so far I've been talking a lot about what they did. The building, the hunting, the migrating, the surviving. But what about who they were? What did they believe? What did they feel? What went on in their inner worlds? And the astonishing thing is that we actually have hints, real evidence that lets us reach into the minds of the missing time. And what we find there is unmistakably fully human in the deepest way. And to start with art again, but a different kind. Beyond the cave paintings, the people of the deep past made portable art. Small carved objects, figurines, ornaments, things made not for any practical purpose at all, but purely because they meant something. There are carved figures going back tens of thousands of years, beautifully worked from ivory and stone. There's one famous carving, often called the Lion Man, found in a cave in Germany and dated to around 40,000 years old. A figure with the body of a human and the head of a lion, painstakingly carved from a mammoth tusk. Sit with that. 40,000 years ago, somebody spent what researchers estimate could have been hundreds of hours carving by hand with stone tools a creature that does not exist, a human-lion hybrid, a being from imagination, from mythology, from the realm of story and the spirit. That carving is proof in the hard physical evidence of abstract, symbolic, imaginative thought. The ability to conceive of something that isn't real and bring it into the world as an object, that is the exact same mental machinery that produces every god, every monster, every superhero, every novel, every religion humans have ever made. 40,000 years ago, it was already fully online. Shangword. And think about the time investment. Hundreds of hours, possibly, on a single carving that you can't eat and can't hunt with and can't wear for warmth. In a world where survival took real effort, somebody, or their community, decided this object was worth hundreds of hours of skilled labor. That tells you these people had surplus, had specialists maybe, and above all, had a powerful sense that meaning mattered, that the symbolic and the spiritual were worth pouring your life into. That's not survival behavior. That's culture. That's religion. That's the human soul, reaching for something beyond the next meal, 40,000 years deep in the missing time. And they adorned themselves too. We've found beads, shell beads, drilled and strung, going back further than you'd ever guess. Some examples on the order of 100,000 years old or more from sites in Africa and the Middle East. Little shells, carefully pierced so they could be worn as necklaces or sewn onto clothing. Why does that matter? Because personal ornament is a deeply social, deeply symbolic act. When you wear a beaded necklace, you're sending a message about who you are, what group you belong to, your status, your identity. Beads are language without words. They mean these people had complex societies with identity and signaling and fashion and belonging 100,000 years ago. They cared how they looked. They cared what they communicated about themselves. They were, in other words, exactly as vain and social and identity obsessed as you are scrolling through your closet deciding what to wear. The impulse to say this is who I am through what I put on my body is at least 100,000 years old. And here's the part that I find almost unbearably moving. They decorated their dead too with these same ornaments. There are burials from the deep past where the body was laid to rest, covered in thousands of beads, painstakingly arranged, representing an enormous investment of labor by the living to honor the dead. Imagine the grief and the love in that, spending who knows how many hours stringing and arranging thousands of beads to clothe someone you've lost, to send them into death adorned and dignified and beautiful. That's not a primitive throwing a body in a hole. That's a funeral, a ceremony, an act of profound love and meaning, identical in spirit to anything we do today. We've also found burials sprinkled with red ochre, a pigment that shows up again and again in connection with the dead across the ancient world, possibly symbolizing blood, life, rebirth, who knows, but clearly carrying deep symbolic weight used deliberately, ritually, across vast distances and time spans. These people had a relationship with death. They had beliefs about it. They very likely believed in something beyond it, or they wouldn't have bothered sending their dead off so carefully equipped and adorned. The question of what happens when we die, the question at the root of nearly every religion and philosophy humans have ever built. They were already asking it and answering it in the missing time. Aninana, now let me give you one more window into their minds. And this one's a little playful, but it tells you so much. They made music. We've found musical instruments from the deep past, flutes, carved from bird bone and from mammoth ivory, with finger holes drilled into them going back something like 40,000 years. Working flutes, functional musical instruments designed to play notes found in the same caves as the great paintings. Think about what that means. 40,000 years ago in the flickering light of a cave, with the lions and mammoths painted on the walls around them, and the Lion Man carving maybe nearby, people were making music. Somebody crafted a flute, learned to play it, and filled that ancient space with melody. There was song. There was rhythm. There was almost certainly dance and ritual built around it. Music, the thing we still turn to for joy and grief and worship and connection, was already part of being human 40,000 years ago. These people sang. They had songs. We will never, ever hear them. And that's one of the great quiet tragedies of the missing time, Sao. But they existed. The caves were full of music. The fires had songs around them. The silence we project onto the past is an illusion created entirely by the limits of what survives. Yeah? And so put it all together one more time, because this portrait is now almost complete, and it's nothing like the cartoon caveman. These were people who carved imaginary gods from mammoth tusks, who strung beads to say who they were, who buried their dead in thousands of ornaments and red ochre with obvious love and belief, who played flutes carved from bone in painted caves, who managed entire continents with fire, who built houses from the bones of giants and sewed fitted clothing with eyed needles to conquer the frozen north, who walked the entire length of 2 continents into the unknown, who watched a world of giant beasts and painted them with reverence. Every single one of these is a marker of a fully modern, fully human mind, symbolic, imaginative, social, spiritual, musical, ingenious, emotional. There is, at this point, simply no honest way to look at the evidence and call these people primitive. They were us, completely. The only thing separating their world from ours is the recent, fragile, world-changing trick of writing things down so they don't get forgotten. And that brings me to a thought that I want to plant in your head before we go further, because it changes how you see this entire story. We keep framing the missing time as a tragedy of loss, and it is all that vanished knowledge, all those silenced songs. But there's another way to see it, and it's almost hopeful. The reason we know any of this, the reason we can reach into a cave or a grave or a stretch of mud and reconstruct the inner life of a person from 40,000 years ago, is that those people were so relentlessly, irrepressibly human that they couldn't help leaving traces of meaning everywhere they went. They didn't have to carve the Lion Man. They didn't have to string the beads or play the flute or paint the lions or bury their dead in ochre. None of it helped them survive. They did it because they were human, and humans make meaning compulsively, everywhere, always, even when no one will ever read it, even with no hope of being remembered. They created beauty into the void, knowing nothing of us, expecting nothing back, and 40,000 years later, here you are, receiving it. The message got through, not because they sent it to us, they had no idea we'd exist, but because the act of making meaning is so fundamentally human that it echoes across any amount of time. Which is maybe the most powerful thing the missing time has to teach you. Those people, with no writing, no expectation of being remembered, no idea that the future even existed in any concrete way, still poured their lives into beauty and ritual and care and song. They lived as if it mattered, because to them, in their moment, it did exactly the way your life matters in your moment right now. And the deep, strange comfort in that is this: the things that make a human life meaningful were never civilization, never technology, never the written record. The things that make a human life meaningful: love, grief, beauty, belonging, curiosity, the reaching towards something bigger. Those were all fully present 300,000 years ago, and they're fully present in you, unchanged. You are running the exact same software, feeling the exact same things as a teenager carrying a child across the mud 20,000 years ago, as a Neanderthal laying flowers on a grave 100,000 years ago, as an artist mixing ochre in the dark to paint a horse. The hardware is identical. The heart is identical. The only difference is that you happen to live in the tiny, bright, recorded sliver, and they lived in the vast and silent and achingly human dark. Okay, so by now, you've probably got one nagging question rattling around, and it's a fair one, maybe the biggest one of all. If these people were so smart, so capable, so completely our equals, and if the missing time was this vast, crowded, achievement-packed stretch of human existence, then how do we actually know any of this? Like, where does all of this come from? Because it's one thing to say there were geniuses in the dark for 300,000 years, and it's another thing to actually prove it from bones and stones and the dirt. So, let me explain, because the detective work that lets us peer into the missing time is its own kind of miracle, and once you understand the tools, the whole story gets even more solid and even more wild. Start with the most obvious thing, the dating. How do we even know a cave painting is 36,000 years old, or a fossil is 315,000? For a long time, honestly, we were guessing, ranking things by which layer of dirt they were buried under. Older stuff deeper down. Useful, but rough. Then came radiocarbon dating, which was a revolution. The idea is beautifully simple. Every living thing absorbs carbon while it's alive, including a tiny amount of a radioactive version of carbon, and the moment it dies, that radioactive carbon starts decaying at a perfectly steady, known rate, like a clock that starts ticking at the moment of death. Measure how much is left, and you can calculate how long ago the thing died. That's how we date the charcoal in a cave painting, the bones in a grave, the wood in a tool. The catch is that radiocarbon only reaches back reliably to around 50,000 years or so. Beyond that, there's too little of the radioactive carbon left to measure, and you hit a wall. Which, by the way, is one reason the deepest parts of the missing time are so murky. For most of our species' 300,000-year existence, that particular clock simply doesn't work, and we need other methods, and we have them. For the really old stuff, Jebel Irhoud, the early fossils, the ancient tools, scientists use other radioactive clocks, like methods that measure the decay in the minerals and sediments around the find, or techniques that measure how long buried grains of sand have been hidden from sunlight. Different clocks for different timescales cross-checked against each other. That's how the Jebel Irhoud team got to 315,000 years. Not a guess, but careful measurement using the natural radioactive timers built into the rock itself. The Earth, it turns out, is full of clocks if you know how to read them. And learning to read them is what dragged the missing time out of pure speculation and into something we can actually measure. But the real game changer, the thing that has utterly transformed our understanding of the deep past in just the last couple of decades, is ancient DNA. And this is genuinely one of the most jaw-dropping scientific achievements of our time. So stay with me. Remember how I told you the Denisovans were discovered from a single pinky bone? That's only possible because scientists figured out how to extract and read genetic material out of fossils tens of thousands of years old. Think about how insane that is. DNA is a fragile molecule. It breaks down after death, shredded into tinier and tinier fragments over time, contaminated by the DNA of everything else that's touched the bone. Bacteria, fungi. The archaeologists who dug it up, reading it from an ancient bone is like trying to reconstruct a shredded book that's been left out in the rain for 40,000 years with pages from 1,000 other books mixed into the pile. And yet, they cracked it. They developed techniques to pull out the genuine ancient fragments, filter out the contamination, and reassemble the genetic code of people who died tens of thousands of years ago. And that's how we know, with hard certainty, the things I told you earlier that might have sounded like wild speculation. That's how we know you carry Neanderthal DNA. They sequenced the Neanderthal genome from ancient bones and compared it to ours. That's how we discovered the Denisovans existed at all and that they live on in living people. That's how we know about the interbreeding, the mixing, the love stories between species, the migrations, and which group went where. The whole map of how humanity spread and merged and split across the missing time is being redrawn right now from genetic data pulled out of ancient bones and even EO. And this is the newest, craziest frontier out of the dirt itself. Because it turns out that ancient humans shed DNA into the soil of the caves they lived in through skin and hair and waste, and scientists can now sometimes pull human DNA straight out of cave sediment with no bones at all and tell you who was living there and when. They can detect the ghosts of people from the dirt they walked on. That is science fiction made real, and it's how the silence of the missing time is very slowly beginning to speak. And here's the crazy part. These tools are getting better every single year. The techniques that let us read a 100,000-year-old genome or pull DNA from sediment barely existed 20 years ago. The accepted picture of human history has been rewritten more in the last 2 decades than in the previous century. Jebel Irhoud, pushing our origin back 100,000 years. Recent. The Denisovans. Recent. The dating that put humans in Australia 65,000 years ago and in the Americas 20-some thousand years ago. Recent and still being argued and pushed back further. Göbekli Tepe. Recent. We are living through a golden age of suddenly being able to hear the missing time. And the wild thing is that almost everything we're learning points the same direction. The deep past was older, richer, more complex, more crowded, and more impressively human than anybody dared to think. Every new tool we point at it, the missing time answers back. You underestimated us again. Which raises a thought that I find genuinely thrilling. And it's the flip side of all that tragedy of loss we've been sitting in. Yes, the overwhelming majority of the missing time is gone, drowned, decayed, forgotten. But we are not done finding what's left. The footprints at White Sands were only properly dated recently. Göbekli Tepe is still mostly unexcavated, with whole stone circles still buried, possibly older ones beneath. There are caves not yet entered, fossils not yet found, and an entire drowned world on the continental shelves that we've barely begun to explore with underwater archaeology. The story isn't finished. The missing time is still leaking back to us fragment by fragment, and the people working on this might, in your lifetime, find something that rewrites the whole thing yet again. Some sealed cave, some deep grave, some sunken settlement off a coastline that cracks open another chapter we didn't know existed. The dark is vast, but we're getting better flashlights. Now, I want to step all the way back because we've covered an enormous amount of ground, and I want to make sure the big picture lands with the full weight it deserves. Let me put you back at that clock from the very beginning, the 24-hour clock representing the 300,000 years of our species. Remember, everything in the history books happens in the last 24 minutes before midnight. But now, you've actually seen what's in the other 23 and a half hours, and it's not empty. Let's walk the clock. At the very start, at midnight, you've got the people of Jebel Irhoud, 315,000 years ago, with our face and our planning mind carrying good stone across the landscape to make their tools. Through the long early hours, multiple human species share the planet: Neanderthals, Denisovans, the hobbits of Flores, and others, meeting, mixing, leaving their genes inside you. Around the equivalent of mid-clock, Neanderthals are laying their dead to rest with flowers 100,000 years ago, and somewhere people are stringing shell beads to say who they are. As the clock rolls on, humans are walking out of Africa in waves, spreading across Asia, and then, 65,000 years ago, building boats and deliberately crossing the open ocean to Australia, a feat we thought was beyond them. Then comes the great flowering of art. 40,000 years ago, flutes carved from bone fill painted caves with music. The Lion Man is carved from a mammoth tusk. Hands are stenciled on walls across the world. 36,000 years ago, the masterpieces of Chauvet. 20-some thousand years ago, a young person carries a child across the mud at White Sands while giant sloths watch and humans pour down through the Americas to the very tip of South America. 12,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers raised the great stone circles of Göbekli Tepe before they've even invented farming. And only then, in the final minutes, comes agriculture and cities and writing and everything you've ever called history. That's the clock. That's what was actually in the dark. Not a waiting room, not a long dumb prologue, a staggering, sprawling, planet-spanning epic of human achievement, courage, art, love, and ingenuity, performed by people with your exact mind, almost none of whom you will ever know anything about. And here's the part that I keep circling back to, the thing I most want you to walk away holding. Those people were not lesser versions of you, they were you. Drop a baby from Jebel Irhoud into a modern family and they'd grow up to use a smartphone and drive a car and argue about movies. No different from anyone. Drop a modern baby into an Ice Age tribe and they'd grow up to nap flint and read the stars and sing the old songs. The difference between us and them was never the brain. It was never the heart. It was only ever the accident of when we happened to be born. Whether before or after humanity stumbled onto the trick of writing things down. And that should do two things to you, I think. First, it should make you humble. We strut around as the pinnacle of everything, the smartest, most advanced humans who ever lived, looking back at the past with a kind of pity. But we are not smarter than the people of the missing time. We just inherited more. We're standing on a mountain 300,000 years tall, built by countless forgotten hands, and we're taking credit for the view. Almost everything you think of as human achievement is the accumulated, written down, never forgotten remainder of work that real people, just like those forgotten ones, started in the dark. We didn't earn the head start. We were handed it. The least we can do is stop sneering at the people who carried the torch through the long night before us. And second, psych, and this is the part I actually find beautiful rather than sad, it should make you feel connected, profoundly, almost physically connected, across an unimaginable gulf of time to every single one of those people, because they're not really strangers, they're family, the most literal kind of family. Every one of them is your direct ancestor or your ancestor's kin, an unbroken chain of parents and children stretching from a person napping flint at Jebel Irhoud all the way down to you watching this right now. Not one link in that chain ever broke. Not one. Through ice ages and droughts, through the drowning of whole coastlines, through the extinction of the giants, through wars and plagues and disasters we'll never know about, every single one of your ancestors survived long enough to have the child that eventually led to you. You are the current living tip of a line that has never once been cut in 300,000 years. That's not a small thing. That's a kind of miracle you carry around without ever thinking about it. And they left you things even though they never knew you'd exist. They left you their genes, the Neanderthal DNA helping run your immune system, the Denisovan gene that, in some people, conquers the thin air of the highest mountains on Earth. They left you their inventions, every fundamental technology, fire and clothing and the boat and the needle and cooking and language itself was worked out in the missing time and handed forward. They left you their art in the few caves the dark protected so that you can stand and look at a horse painted 36,000 years ago and feel the same jolt of recognition the painter felt. They left you their stories in the rare unbroken threads like those Australian songs that remember a drowned coastline across 10,000 years. They left you, honestly, the whole foundation of what it means to be human. The meaning-making, the burying of the dead with love, the music around the fire, the reaching toward the stars. You didn't start any of it. You inherited all of it. From them, from the people in the dark. So the next time you hear somebody throw around the word caveman like it's an insult, like it means stupid, brutish, less than, I want you to remember what we actually know now. Remember the flowers at Shanidar. Remember the boats that crossed the open ocean. Remember the brain surgery survived with stone tools, the aspirin chewed for a toothache 50,000 years ago, the 20-ton pillars raised on a hilltop by people who hadn't even started farming. Remember the flutes and the lion man and the thousands of beads sewn over a beloved body. Remember the masterpieces in the dark that the experts refused to believe could be real because they were simply too good to be that old. That phrase, too good to be that old. That's the whole story of how we've gotten the deep past wrong over and over. We keep assuming that people of the missing time couldn't possibly have been that good, and we keep being proven wrong. Turns out the cavemen were never the dumb ones in this story. We were for thinking so little of the people who made us everything we are. The missing 100,000 years, well, the missing 300,000 really isn't a gap in somebody else's history. It's the lost chapters of your own family story, written by people exactly as alive and clever and feeling as you are, and erased only because they had the bad luck to live before the page was invented. Almost all of it is gone for good, drowned under 400 feet of water and buried under the weight of deep time, and will never get most of it back. But the pieces that survived, the footprints, the paint, the bones, the genes, the songs, they're enough to know the truth. The dark wasn't empty. It was full of us. It always was. That's it for this one. If your brain feels a little rearranged right now, good. That's kind of the point. And it means you'll probably enjoy the rest of what we make. So stick around. We've got a whole pile of stories like this. The kind of stuff that quietly resets how you see the world. Until the next one, keep looking at the past like the people in it were just as real as you. Because they were.